Everybody is talking about inflation, but the reality is that at the end of the day, this is not about inflation. This is about the cost of bringing inflation down to 2%, which is the target. The Bank of Canada, the Fed in the US have established their reputation as inflation fighters. They are not going to toss it away. Given a choice between a recession and inflation, they will take a recession any day. That's the reality. The trajectory of inflation is important here. This trajectory is changing. At any point in time, there are two sources of inflation: supply-driven inflation and demand-driven inflation. What we are seeing more and more is that the contribution of the supply-driven inflation is diminishing, which means that supply chain is improving, shipping cost is down, and that's actually extremely good because it means that the Bank of Canada is becoming more powerful in its ability to deal with the situation, because more and more inflation is not coming from the outside, but rather from domestic sources where the Bank of Canada can do something about. What's the next move? The Bank of Canada is now at 4.25 overnight rate. We think it's done. We think that's the end of it. Maybe another 25 basis points if they're up to, but we are basically extremely close, maybe at the end of the hiking cycle. The next question, of course, is what's next? When are you cutting? Usually the lag between the last hike and the first easing move is relatively short. This time, we believe it will be relatively long, maybe a year, maybe early 2024. Why? Because the Bank of Canada and the Fed have to make sure that inflation is dead before there is monetary policy. The last thing they want to do is to repeat the mistakes of the 1970s, when monetary policy was eased prematurely and led to another wave of inflation, and therefore the double dip recession of the early 1980s. They would like to avoid that, and therefore they will wait until inflation is dead before they cut. And then when they cut, by how much? Now, we started this saga at 175 overnight rate. We are going to 425, 4.5. We rest for a year and then cut. To where? I say about 3%, a full percentage point, maybe more, above the rate we have seen before the crisis. Why? Because in the background, there are three inflationary forces that are putting pressure on overall inflation. We are talking about deglobalization. We are talking about just-in-case inventories that are replacing just-in-time inventory. And clearly, the labor market is much tighter now with vacancy rates in the sky. And the target is the same target, still 2%. So in order to achieve the same target with more inflationary forces, by definition, interest rates have to be higher. The new neutral rate, about 3%, clearly higher than what it was before the crisis. What's the risk? Overshooting. To the extent that supply chain does not behave, to the extent that we don't see a significant decline in the external source of inflation, that will lead to a situation in which the Bank of Canada will overshoot, will raise interest rates to 5, 5.5. That will take you to a real recession with the unemployment rate rising significantly. Every economic recession was helped, if not caused, by a monetary policy error in which central bankers raise interest rates too much. At this point of the game, it seems that the Bank of Canada is getting it. They would like to avoid this risk, basically stop at 4.25. That's the main case scenario. Let's talk about the housing market now. The housing market is extremely sensitive to higher interest rates than in any other time in history. It is slowing down. Is it a correction? Is it a crash? Is it a meltdown? In order to answer those questions, we have to understand what happened to the housing market during COVID. We know that prices went up by 46% in 2 years. The question is why? The answer is the asymmetrical nature of the crisis. All the jobs that were lost were low-paying jobs, young people, renters. That's why rent actually went down during the pandemic. At the same time, home buyers and even potential home buyers, their job was there, they were zooming, their income was there, and interest rates was in the basement. So basically, we have a situation in which, if you think about it for a second, home buyers during COVID got the benefit of a recession vis-a-vis extremely low interest rate without the cost of a recession vis-a-vis a broadly based increase in the unemployment rate. There was a sense of urgency to get into the market. So if you have a sense of urgency to get into the market, you front load activity. You borrow activity from the future. We are in the future. This is not a free fall. This is not a crash. This is reallocation of activity over time. We front-loaded activity. Now we are resting due to higher interest rates. That's a very positive development. It's not over. Now, this is the first correction ever in which the supply resale activity is actually down. Usually you see supply listing going up when the market is correcting. This is not the case now. Supply is down because people simply are worried about the overall situation. They're not willing to list, and therefore supply is down by 10% on a year-over-year basis. That's protecting prices from falling further. I believe that will change in 2023 and 2024. We will see supply rising because the fog will clear, but also some people will be forced to sell given the huge increase in interest rates and the shock that they will experience moving from variable rates to fixed rates or renewing their variable rates. And therefore, I see further downward pressure in the housing market in 2023. However, it's not a crash. It's not a meltdown. It's a very healthy correction. So expect to see further decline in sales and clearly decline in prices, especially in the low-rise segment of the market. At the same time, remember, the fundamentals of this market are still very strong. This year alone, we got 700,000 new immigrants plus non-permanent residents, foreign students, and people from Ukraine. 700,000. None of them carries his or her house on their back. The demand is there. And what's happening to supply? We are not building. 1/3 of activity is being canceled or delayed because of the fact cost rising too fast. So you don't have the supply coming. The demand is definitely there. You don't need to be an economist to see what will happen 2 or 3 years from now. So the fundamentals of the market, the lack of supply, a lot of demand still there. But at the same time, the market is now adjusting, basically reflecting the asymmetrical nature of this recession.